Okay, hey guys. So here's the next tutorial. I believe this is the fourth that will be covering an introduction to Illustrator. Again, thinking about the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop. Illustrator is primarily an image manipulation tool, so it's really great for modifying an image, enhancing it, changing the tonality, blurring, filters, all those other things that can go along with photo editing that makes sense to happen there in Photoshop, right? Illustrator is much more about, I would say, layout. You can also create some simple illustration elements using Illustrator. So it's much more for laying things out. So like the images that you create in Photoshop, perhaps they become an element that's laid out here in Illustrator and becomes part of an overall composition. And that's actually what you guys are going to be working on with the photo montages. So the primary tools that we'll be covering here, well, first just looking at the interface, it's fairly similar to Photoshop. Along the top, we have menu pull downs. There are various functions there. Along the left-hand side, you have your primary toolbar, and I'll be showing you some of the tools that we're going to be working with here. And on the right side are panels, and so that's where you're going to find layers, which is this little tool. You'll find other elements as well, like links, images that might be linked to it, swatches. I don't have any swatches loaded right now. Text editing will be found here. So a lot of those elements there on the side panels. So the primary tools that we'll be using here, let me just, I guess I'll start with opening a new image and showing you how to create an appropriate artboard for your photo montage exercise. So I'm going to click on File and just select New. So here, the name, I'm just going to select Photo Montage Example 1. The profile is fine. The number of artboards, so you can have many layouts here. I'm just going to stick to one, but sometimes students will have, if there's multiple boards and an overall presentation, let's say, for a project, they'll have the boards all laid out in Illustrator. So you can have multiple 24 by 36 sheets or what have you. It can start to get bogged down. It gets a little bit confusing zooming around and really getting detailed with things, but sometimes folks will do that. The size, this is similar to selecting like a size that you're going to print on a printer. So you can have letter, legal. I'm selecting tabloid, which is 11 by 17, and the various A and B size. You can also customize one, but we won't need to do that here. So tabloid, that ends up being 11 by 17. If I would change this, then that would change that to a custom. Inches will be the primary units. The other choice would be these that you see here, but generally inches make sense since we're going to be printing these out one-to-one scale. Orientation, I can select a portrait or a landscape. I'm going to select the landscape here. The advanced, this is talking about the color mode, and I touched on this a little bit before. So CMYK is what's known in the printing industry as the 4-color process. RGB, red, green, and blue, is 3-color process. And so 4 colors has more information, and you're going to get more accurate tones using more of these colors, which are cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So those are the 4 colors that I'll be printed with. And there are others. I think the printers that we have in the computer studio have even more of those colors, so it's expanded on. But if you want something to be more accurate as you render it out, CMYK is the mode you really want to be working on. And they might end up with larger file sizes. That's more so true for Photoshop. If you're working in a 4-color process in Photoshop, those files can get pretty big. There's just more color information there. And then RGB is a little bit more streamlined. So what I tend to recommend in Photoshop is that students work in RGB, and at the end they can convert it to CMYK, and that's in the image mode in Photoshop. raster effect, so it's going to be have a 300 pixels per inch resolution. That's fine. I could raise or lower that as need be, but I'm going to keep it at high right now. And that should do it. So I'll say OK. Now we have our artboard here. Now, one of the things that I like to have up right away are the rulers. So I don't have anything to measure. I don't know really where I am in this space, and I tend to like to use guidelines and so forth. So I will show my ruler. So I'll go into View, go down to Rulers, Show Rulers. So 0, 0 is up here at the upper left-hand corner, and then we get to 17 and 11 down there. So that starts to be a set-up sheet. Now I can start to work with various tools and show you how they work. So the first one is a selection tool. I'm just going to create a quick object here. And so it's a simple rectangle. And this is called the selection tool, which is the keyboard shortcut is V. And direct selection tool. So the difference is if I just have the V, the regular selection tool, and I go to select this object, you can see these little grips show up for this shape, and I grab one of these corners. I can change the shape of it, but I can't do it dynamically, meaning it's always maintaining its rectilinearity. So I could change the scale, the proportion of it, and again, if I wanted to keep that proportion, I could hold my Shift key down, which I'm doing right now. So I just wanted to make it bigger or smaller, so you can kind of use it as a scale tool as well. So that's helpful for certain things, especially if you just want to do some pretty straightforward manipulation. The direct selection tool, and to do this, I'll try to select on the line, not on one of those grips. So if I select on that line, and it's a little bit hard to see with the resolution of this display, but these grips now are open. So I can select one of those anchors, so they're called here, and now I can dynamically change that shape. So I can do whatever I want to do in terms of manipulating that as a shape. And I can keep doing that on to the next. So fundamentally, though, that's the difference between those tools. We'll be using the text tool, so there's some basics to that. I just selected that text tool. I'm just dragging a box here, and that's going to basically create a text box. So I can fill that up with text accordingly. So that's one way to create text. If I hold down here, again, the little corner, dog-eared corner, means there's more tools there. There's an area type tool, type on path tool. So say, for example, I wanted to create type along this path right here. Now I can use this tool, and my text will start there. It's going to follow that all the way around. So that can be interesting for certain things. Start to create for some fairly dynamic illustrations. Vertical type tool, so if you want to create vertical type. And then the area tool. So I haven't not really used much that area tool. So the primary ones that we'll be using here is the straightforward type tool and the type on path tool. Perhaps we can get into some of these more these other tools accordingly. But basically, the vertical type tool is just that. It's gonna let you type vertically as opposed to horizontally. If I wanted to now erase that, I can just go back to my selection tool, and I'm just gonna hit delete. Same for this, maybe I'll hit delete. Maybe I'll keep that. Just move that around. Okay, there's a line tool, so I can create just a simple line, and I can give it various attributes here. It's nice with the newer versions of Illustrator. Then I have some control here, so I can automatically adjust the stroke color. Even if I wanted to change it to a different color, I can do that here. That affects the fill and stroke down below as well, you'll see. And whenever I have an object selected and I change this set of images here, or the colors rather, it's going to affect that image that's selected. So yeah, I had that like red, and the fill was, let's say, yellow. So now that's going to have a fill of yellow. It's just a line, so it doesn't have fill. Fill would be the area within, but it's going to affect that. So that'll stay there. Now I have this, and I can always then just reset it to black, black. And this will maintain the characteristics that I just created. If I want to just change this back to black and black, I could go here and reset it to the default. And there you go. It's a little bit just maintaining this here a little bit using this tool. You can see right now that it actually has a white fill, and that's because of the fill here, and it's a little bit different from Photoshop where it's a foreground, background. Here it's fill and stroke, and so I can change the stroke color to something, and I can use swatches, or I can use the eyedropper to select something, but so I could change that color, so you can see that changed, and I can click on foreground and change that color in order to create different color patterns, arrangements, let's say. I could also select nothing, so if I wanted this to be empty, I could just select this red diagonal line slash here, and then that just means there's no fill. I could do the same for stroke, so if I didn't want a stroke around this, I just wanted the white there, I would get rid of that black line stroke, and I just have that white. Okay. So that was the line. Here are different shapes. So instead of marquee, it's an M similar to Photoshop, and that would get you to the rectangle tool. It's not a selection tool. It's to actually create shapes. And so you can create a rectangle and ellipses and those types of simple shapes. You can also create your own shapes. I'll back up here to this pen tool. Using that pen tool, and I can close it, so I can create customized shapes if I wanted to, and this basically ends up controlling the radius of that. I expect you guys really to get into that a little bit more advanced. Oops, Control Z. You have to be careful with dragging selection. I'm used to AutoCAD and Rhino, but you notice I selected a bunch of objects, and it creates this big box. I have to be very careful that I don't delete things that I want to keep. Clean this up a little bit. So it automatically selected this area, so I wanted to make sure I don't do that. Okay. So shape tools. You can also, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see. I'm going to swap those, move it over here. There's an airbrush tool, a brush tool, paintbrush. And so you can start to create different, this right now is just set to white stroke, but basically what I'm doing is just creating this line. But what it's going to do, as opposed to Photoshop, Photoshop will keep it as pixels. This is actually going to keep it vector based. So the fact that I can see all these lines and manipulate it the way I can, these different shapes, is because it's all based on vectors as opposed to little dots of resolution. That's Photoshop generally does that. Illustrator is a vector based. And so you can see there's a little control lines here, so I could actually go in with my direct select tool and tweak some of these little curly cues if I wanted to. So that's that. Delete. Let's see, pencil tool. Similarly, it's going to give me, you can see it's tracing, and it's going to give me some line work there, and I could create a bigger stroke, a thicker stroke, or a less stroke, and control the color of it, and manipulate it just like a shape now. So instead of, again, pixels, it's vectors. Tends to work better with bringing line work that you might want to change the line weight and so forth from like Rhino and Illustrator, or Rhino and AutoCAD, to bring that into Illustrator, because you have control of line weights and so forth. So you can tweak it that way. Okay, so it's pencil tool, erase tool, fairly self-explanatory. I tend to just use the delete key. Rotate, you can also do that with the basic selection tool. So if I go off of the corner, you can see there's the arrows change a little bit, and I can start to rotate this object. If I hold my shift key down, it's going to hold it to 90 degrees and 45 degrees if I wanted to be precise with that. If I wanted to really be precise, I can then use the rotation tool and type in degrees for rotation. I'm not seeing that right now, and I don't expect you to get into that level of precision with this. It's kind of more for drafting and so forth. Let's see, where were we? Scale tool, again, you can use this for scale, or the selection tool. Generally, when you have this open, I have the selection tool, I have an object selected, I could start to change the width and the height here. I can have them linked if I want to maintain proportions, but let's say if I wanted to make it a little wider, this shape, I could just do that by typing in here. Again, I broke the proportion key now, so then if I wanted to type that up to 6, it's going to maintain the proportion of what was there. So that's when that is clicked. And this is its location, basically, on the artboard. You can see that changing. Let's see. Other tools that you'll be working with. This isn't a bad tool to work with, and these aren't great images for that, so I'm going to bring in an image. And the way there's a few ways you can bring in images in, and again, I like the most expedited way generally, where I will take an image and I will just drag it onto the artboard there. And then I can scale it, so Control-C that. So I can grab that corner and I can maintain the proportion, hold my shift key down, and bring that in. I'm going to maybe get rid of this one. And so now this is an image. It's a linked image, and I don't have the link. The link is here, but if you want to show more tools to the right-hand side, you can bring up various dialog boxes to give you more or less information. So here's the image that's selected, and it's telling me that where it's located, and it's in my raw folder file, in all its attributes. So it's referencing that externally, and that's default to Illustrator. Automatically will link it, so it's not embedded within the program itself. It's actually reaching outside to that file location and mapping it back and bringing it in. You could embed it if you want, and that's another method to place images, which is just File and Place. Up here, you notice I changed my file format. So here's the main folder, which is photo montage example, and I created a few different folders. One of the folders is raw, so that'd be raw images that were brought in. Others are working, so if I was manipulating an image in Photoshop or what have you, I would want to keep that separate from the original raw image just in case I needed to go back. In this case, just referencing it externally, I could select it this way. And also you notice here down below it says there's a little toggle here where you can say link or not link. So if I have it unchecked, it's going to embed it, and your Illustrator file is going to get huge with all those images, or I could link it. So I tend to use the link method here. Again, the quick and easy method that I always like using is just drag that puppy in there. And I will do the same with, this is the PNG that was created from the previous tutorial. So I'll make sure I don't have anything selected, get back to that folder, and then slide that puppy Oh, that's the raw image. That doesn't have the transparency. There you go. I have to go to my working images. Working. Here's the one that was created. Now that one has the transparency. And I can scale it. Selection tool. Bring that in. Now it's a true overlay. And again, I know I'm showing architecture here for that overlay. You know, I really want you guys just to work with the 11 by 17 sheet. So start with placing images, think about text, and start drawing or extracting. It's an abstract exercise. I want you guys to experiment, express, you know, getting used to using the tools, but stay loose with these, right? You want to convey a message, but you also want to be as creative as you can with it. So stay loose with it. So again, I know I'm being conservative here with showing a piece of architecture, because that's what I had, but you guys should be, you know, thinking a little bit more abstractly, and I'll show, I think, some examples here in a bit. Okay, so eyedropper tool, that started all that. So I can select a color anywhere on any image that's within Illustrator, and that would automatically start to become part of the fill color and so forth. So if I wanted that kind of purple color, I can select that. If I wanted that, you know, darker color. So if you're trying to create an overall tone, a palette of tonality within the image, it's kind of nice to draw from the images that you're bringing into the overall composition, as opposed to using some other kind of off the wall, you know, really red, really blue kind of colors. So it's nice to be able to use that within. So say I wanted to use this blue. I'll zoom in a little bit, and maybe I wanted to use that blue. Now if I create a shape, it's going to have that blue. That could start to help, you know, in terms of the overall composition, of course. And I could also then use my eyedropper tool to change other objects. So say I wanted to try to fill that in, I should be able to, fills in the text in this case. So now the text is that color. So maybe that's okay. Maybe I'll keep that. Something to work with. Let's see, moving down. This is for blending various shapes. So if I wanted to add or shapes together, you could start to do that. Don't necessarily need to use that, I think, for this exercise so much. Symbol spray tool, it's for spraying funky symbols that are kind of like blocks in Illustrator. Again, I don't really think you guys need to be using that for this. Graphs we won't be using. This is really for a tool for, say you're creating business cards or something like that, you could create crop marks, so you can actually make physical cuts, and that'll do that around the artboard. So that's kind of nice if you're doing something like that. You're going to be printing at 11 by 17, so you won't really need to use that, but that's really what that's about. The hand tool, we won't be using this slice tool in this case either. The hand tool, again, is for panning, so I can pan around, and also if I double click it, it's going to fill the overall view, so it's a nice quick shortcut to kind of fill the screen up with your overall artboard. I can double click and get to a similar kind of view with the magnifying glass, but I can also zoom in on specific areas if I wanted to do that and be really precise with that kind of viewing. Again, we have the fill color and the stroke color here, and we know that this then means that there's no, so in this case there's no stroke because that has that red line through it, and we know we can always go back to the defaults there. The other things that are important along the right hand side here are where you could find the layers. So right now I haven't been working with any layers. This is all just on one layer, and I generally don't like to work that way. So you can see, similar to Photoshop here, there's a little symbol at the base that says create new layer. And if I double click on the name, I can change the title of it. So in this case, I'll say text body. And my cap locks down. There we go. So body text, create another one, and maybe I wanted like a special title text, and I wanted those independent from the rest of the body in case I wanted something to be behind or in front of. And again, the order in which that you see these layers is the order that they will be viewed. So things in front of or behind or correspond with this arrangement. Layer 1, I'll double click on that, and maybe I'll just say image main. Maybe there's a main image. You're going to be bringing in some line work. Double click on that, so maybe I'll say line overlay. Okay, now all these objects are still on the one layer here, right? So if I turn that off, they're all gone. And I don't want them all on image main, so what I'll do is use my selection tool and say, for example, I wanted this line work to go on its corresponding layer. I'll take this little box and just drag it up to the layer that I want it to be on. Okay, so now it's on that layer. I can work with it independently. If I wanted to, sometimes you have a lot of objects over one another as you're working in Illustrator, and if I didn't want to select this image anymore, just put it in the corner there. So say now that's set, I don't really want to move it anymore, I can lock that layer. And so that's helpful. Now I can't select it even if I try. I can select other objects that are in front of it. So I'm going to take this object and maybe slide that up to body text. Perhaps this is image main, so that's fine. And maybe there's another layer that's like image background or something. And these are just general layers that I tend to use. You can come up with your own, but it's good to start organizing these accordingly, because once you start to have a more elaborate overall file, you'll find that it's important to have layer management sort of in check, just like file management with what I showed you before. One other layer that I'll bring up is for guides. So I'm going to create that layer, and I'm going to move it all the way up. There we go. And guides, you can create guides in both Photoshop and Illustrator. And in Illustrator, they're selectable, so you can kind of move them around. And I tend to put them on a particular layer as opposed to using the hide guides pull down here. It's just a little bit quicker. So I'm on the guides layer, and if I wanted to create a guideline somewhere, say near the horizon of this image, get back on the right layer, I can just go to the rulers here and just click down and drag down this line. So it's going to give me a horizontal line. So I'll get close, to the horizon there, something around there-ish, close. So I don't know, maybe I want to arrange something there eventually, I'm not sure. I can do the same from the left and drag a vertical guide. Start to help just for arranging things. So those are helpful. And then if I don't want to see them anymore, select them, because again, I could select it here. I could lock that layer, so now I can't select it. It's going to tell me it's a guide though. And I could just turn it off if I don't want to see it in the preview. The other way to do that is to go up to the menu, pull down view, and then here guides, and I can hide guides, lock guides, or clear guides. So a few different ways to work through that. Some of the other tools I think that are important, and I'll just look at a piece of this text. And so I was just in the regular selection tool there, and I selected this text that we created before, and I just double clicked on it. If I just double click on it, it's going to automatically convert me to a text editing tool. So now I could select an area of text. And if I then go to the font tool over here, or the font menu, I could also go up here to type and get to different sizes and and so forth. But I'll stick with this one. So type in, maybe I could change the font here if I wanted to. I don't know, just go to Arial, bold, italic, and then I can increase the size. So if I wanted there to be some really big text, I can increase the size there. I can adjust some of these other variables here, like the kerning and so forth. So you can start to get pretty detailed with some of this. So but that's one that ends up to be pretty important. There's also paragraphs modification, so you can set up how it's justified and so forth if you had like a text box and you wanted to control that a little bit more. Now it's going to the last selection there. Again, I can select this and go back to character and then lower the font size, and then I could go to paragraph and change the justification accordingly and work with it that way. Also, if I had a, it's getting kind of messy here, let's clean some of this up. And just to stress the point that we did create a nice transparent image in Photoshop that we could work with here. So that line work is overlaying right with that sky there. And again, I was kind of playing around, not thinking too much about composition here, but you can get the idea. Okay. So I can also create various shapes. So I selected the path tool here, or the text tool to follow the path, so that's following along the path. But if I had another shape, and I'm just looking for my pen. Say I had, something like that, and then I wanted to have text within that. That's not what I wanted to do. Delete that. Control Z. I should be able to use that as the area for text. So I just selected the path. It was the text area type tool, and I just selected the line, and now accepted that as the shape, so now all my text can fit in that particular area. Sorry, that just took a second. I can double click on it to get back to editing, so if I wanted to then change the size of the font like we talked about before, I can do that. So I can start creating some pretty dynamic text situations using these tools. And that's the idea here, to be expressive, got some dumb text going in here, and to kind of communicate an idea. In this case, you guys are working with the site and the idea of motion, and so you're using some of those tools, and the text and how you begin to arrange some of these elements should help to reinforce that. Just a few images that you guys can think about working with in terms of like multimedia. You could start to really think about annotation to help punctuate certain areas of an image. We talked about motion. In this case, it's using the blur tool. Start really kind of playing with white space and allowing that to be as a compositional element, as well as the body of what may be, or the object within that image, really working with different points of view, and just, again, being expressive. You can kind of think of it as sort of a collage, but the idea here is that you're conveying a particular message, drawing from different media sources in order to convey a particular idea using photograph, and so therefore photo montage. So those are just some general examples. There are some others that are relative to what you're doing. Again, if you're thinking about motion, you take several photographs. Thinking about the overlay in a slightly different way, the dynamic of images, this kind of mosaic sort of effect. And here's a kind of an example of a more architectural, of course, but a drawing overlay, right? It's filling in things that are happening within this overall space and just doing that as like trace paper over a drawing that's already been established. I wanted you to think much more abstractly, just graphically, deal with the sheet of the paper two-dimensionally, what that's about in order to convey certain ideas. See here, David Lynch, and just this little bit of text starts to really set up a very particular kind of motion through the overall board there. You can see here kind of a stylization of the figure that's drawn in the background here with this sort of overlay there. Again, various different pieces of text, images, different scales. You can see the fly there, an image of a child here, the eyeball, clouds, and all these are coming together to convey a particular message. And I want you guys to think about that, again, expressively, creatively, be experimental with the overall piece, and be dynamic with it as well. These are some Russian constructivist posters that tend to really use visual literacy, the dynamic, angularity, your eye moving across the page. You can see here this overall kind of Z configuration here, the different textures and scales of font, scales of imagery and text. A few inspirational pieces for you guys to look at. Okay. Well, that'll wrap this one up for Illustrator. I will do follow-up tutorials as we get a little bit more embedded into using this tool and Photoshop. So we'll be doing some follow-ups and also start to take question and answers in class as I return next week. So thank you for watching, and yeah, until the next one.